The air in Dust Devil Springs hangs thick and yellow, smelling of grit, sweat, and cheap whiskey. It's a town that grinds people down, and today, it's grinding Clara Mae Thompson to dust. She stands on a rickety platform, usually reserved for livestock, her calico dress frayed, her belly swollen with a life she can no longer protect. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Croft with a stained vest and a voice like gravel, is losing his patience. The novelty of the spectacle has worn off, and the crowd is restless. Her value, it seems, is plummeting with the afternoon sun. Jedediah Finch, the man who brought her to this place, who whispered promises in her ear until she was his and then cast her aside, is gone. He lost her in a card game last night, and the winner, a disgruntled mule skinner, wanted currency, not a burden. So here she is, the final, humiliating settlement of a drunkard's debt. Come on, folks. A strong back, a woman's touch about the homestead. Croft bellows, though his eyes betray his disgust. What my bid? $1? 50 cents. A cruel laugh ripples through the small crowd of dusty-looking men. 50 cents for 2 mouths to feed? One of them scoffs. I'll give you a sack of flour. At least the flour won't talk back. The insult lands like a slap. Clara flinches, wrapping her arms tighter around her stomach, a desperate, futile gesture of protection. She stares at her worn-out boots, praying for the ground to swallow her whole. The humiliation is a physical thing, a hot poker branding her soul. She is less than human. She is barter. She is worth a sack of flour. A sack of flour it is. Croft declares, eager to be done. Going once, going twice. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The sharp crack of a horse galloping hard cuts through the stagnant air. Dust billows at the edge of the town square as a lone rider pulls his bay, gelding, to a rearing halt. Every head turns. The man swings down from the saddle before the horse's hooves have even settled. He's tall and lean, built of whipcord and silence, his face shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He moves with a purpose that makes the loitering men shrink back. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scan the scene, taking in the sneering auctioneer, the jeering crowd, and finally, the lone figure on the platform. A flicker of disbelief, then a terrible, gut-wrenching recognition crosses his face. He doesn't see a piece of unwanted property. He sees the girl with corn silk hair who used to race him to the creek, the one who shared a stolen apple with him behind the old schoolhouse. He sees Clara Mae. He strides forward, his worn leather chaps making a soft, rhythmic hiss. The crowd parts for him, silenced by the cold fire in his gaze. He stops directly in front of the platform, his eyes locking with Clara's. For a moment, she doesn't dare to hope. It can't be. Not him. Not after all these years. $10, he says, his voice low and rough, but carrying over the sudden silence like a thunderclap. He pulls a small, worn pouch from his belt. In coin. Silas Croft's jaw hangs open. He looks from the formidable stranger to the worthless sack of flour and back again. The choice is not a difficult one. He stammers, sold, to the stranger for $10. The man, Elias Thorne, doesn't wait for a receipt. He steps onto the platform, ignoring the auctioneer completely. He reaches out a calloused hand, not to claim property, but to help a person down. Clara stares at his hand, trembling, her world tilting on its axis. He had been a memory, a ghost from a life she thought long buried. Now, he was here, real and solid, his shadow falling over her, chasing away the glare of the hateful sun. And with 3 words, "Come on, Clara," his life and hers were irrevocably changed. Elias led her away from the platform without a backward glance. The silence of the crowd was now one of stunned confusion rather than cruel mockery. He untied the reins of his bay, his movements economical and sure. He didn't speak, and Clara was grateful for it. Words were impossible things right now, lodged in her throat behind a knot of shame and a relief so profound it felt like pain. He simply gestured for her to wait, then strode into the general store. He emerged a moment later, not with a receipt of purchase, but with a small canteen of fresh water and a wrapped piece of salted beef. He pressed them into her hands. Her fingers were so cold and numb they could barely close around them. The ride out of Dust Devil Springs was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. Elias had wordlessly helped her onto the back of his horse, settling her in front of him. The warmth of his body seeped through her thin dress, a stark contrast to the icy dread that had encased her for days. His arm was a steady, solid presence around her waist, holding her securely in the saddle. She kept her back ramrod straight, trying to maintain a sliver of distance, a pretense of separation that neither of them believed. She was his, bought and paid for. The thought was a fresh wave of sickness. But the hand that held her was gentle, its grip firm but not confining, and the body behind her was a shield against the gawking eyes of the town. Elias Thorne's ranch, Thorn Creek, was nestled deep in the rugged hill country, a good 2 hours' ride from the judgment of town. It was a place carved out of hardship and persistence. The land was unforgiving, all rock and stubborn juniper, but a small, clear creek cut through it, giving it life and a name. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the vast, empty sky. A corral held a couple of other horses, and a small barn, leaning but resolute, stood nearby. It was a lonely place, a place of solitude, a place of safety. As they rode into the clearing, Elias slowed the bay to a walk. "This is it," he said, the first full sentence he'd spoken to her. His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by time and dust. He dismounted and reached up for her. For a terrifying second, she hesitated, her muscles locking up. His face softened with a flicker of understanding. "It's all right, Clara. You're safe here." She allowed him to lift her down, her feet finding the solid ground with a jolt. She felt unsteady, lightheaded. He kept a hand on her elbow to steady her. She looked at him, then really looked at him for the first time. The boy she knew was gone. In his place was a man, his face weathered by the sun and etched with lines of worry around his eyes. He looked tired, but his gaze was clear and direct. He was still Elias. The same Elias who'd once dared her to climb the old oak and then panicked when she'd scraped her knee, carrying her home on his back. Clara's own past was a fresh, gaping wound. Jedediah Finch had found her working in a boarding house back east, an orphan with no prospects. He was handsome, flush with cash from some land deal, and he'd painted a beautiful picture of a life in the West, a wife, a home, respectability. She had believed him. She had given him everything she had, which was only herself. The dream had soured the moment her pregnancy began to show. He became distant, then cruel. The journey west was not to build a home, but to discard a problem. When his money ran out in Dust Devil Springs, he'd seen her not as the mother of his child, but as his last asset to be liquidated. The auction was the final, brutal proof of her worthlessness in his eyes. Now, standing in the quiet yard of this forgotten ranch, she was owned by someone else, a childhood friend. Did that make it better or worse? She couldn't decide. The awkwardness was a chasm between them. He was her savior, her owner, a ghost from her past. He seemed to feel it too. He dropped his hand from her elbow and shoved it in his pocket, looking toward the cabin. "The house is, well, it's not much, but it's warm. You can have the bed. I'll take the barn." Her head snapped up. "No, I couldn't." "It's not a request," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Go on inside. I'll see to the horse." She watched him lead the bay toward the barn, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the long ride. She turned and faced the cabin door. It was a simple, rough plank door, but it felt like the entrance to a new world. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed it open and stepped across the threshold, from the nightmare of the auction block into the terrifying uncertainty of her new life. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A fire crackled softly in the stone hearth. It was sparse, a man's home, but it was clean. A rough sawn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A bed, covered with a thick wool blanket, was tucked into a corner. It was the first safe space she had been in for months. Her legs gave out, and she sank into one of the chairs, burying her face in her hands as the first, wrenching sobs of a long-suppressed grief finally broke free. Elias lingered in the barn longer than he needed to, brushing down the bay until the horse's coat shone like polished mahogany. He was giving her time, giving himself time. His mind was a maelstrom. Seeing her on that platform had been like a punch to the gut. The Clara May he remembered was all laughter and flying ribbons, fearless and bright. The woman he'd brought home was a ghost, her eyes hollowed out by fear and shame. He'd left home himself not long after she had, chasing work, trying to build something of his own after his parents passed. He'd bought this piece of land with every cent he had, and for 5 years, he'd fought it, bled for it, and mostly lost. He was no prosperous rancher. He was a man barely clinging on. The $10 he'd paid for her was nearly everything he had to his name until he could sell a few head of cattle in the fall. It had been an act of pure, unthinking instinct, a rebellion against the ugliness he'd witnessed. Now, the consequences were settling in. He had a woman to care for, a pregnant woman, and God only knew what kind of trouble would follow her. He finally walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy on the packed earth. He paused at the door, hearing the sound of her crying. It was a raw, broken sound that twisted something in his chest. He pushed the door open quietly. She was sitting at the table, her shoulders shaking. He didn't know what to do. He was a man of action, not words. Comfort was a language he barely spoke. He walked over to the hearth, stoked the fire, and put a pot of coffee on a boil. The simple, domestic act seemed to calm the frantic energy in the room. He took a tin plate from a shelf and put a few biscuits on it, left over from his morning meal. He set the plate on the table in front of her, along with a cup. He didn't say anything. Clara slowly lifted her head, her face tear-streaked and pale. Her eyes fell on the plate of biscuits. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. Her hunger was a sharp, biting thing. She picked one up, her hand trembling, and took a small bite. It was dry and hard, but it was food. It was an offering, a small, quiet act of kindness in a world that had shown her nothing but brutality. She looked at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and tears. Elias just nodded, pouring coffee in her cup. He sat down opposite her, cradling his own cup in his large, calloused hands. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. The raw panic had subsided, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. He had bought her, yes, but he hadn't chained her. He'd given her food, warmth, and the dignity of a closed door. "What was his name?" Elias asked, his voice low. He needed to know. He needed a name for the anger that was simmering inside him. Clara flinched, the biscuit forgotten in her hand. Jedediah Finch. Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard the name. A gambler, a swindler, known for leaving a trail of trouble behind him. "He won't find you here," he said, and it was a vow. The first few days at Thorn Creek were a study in silent navigation. Clara and Elias moved around each other like cautious animals. Their shared history a strange, invisible barrier between them. Elias was true to his word, taking a few blankets and moving into the barn, leaving her the sole occupant of the cabin and its solitary bed. Every morning, he would leave a stack of firewood and a bucket of fresh water by the door before he rode out to check his fences or move his small herd of cattle. He was a ghost in her life, a provider she rarely saw. Clara spent those days in a daze of sleep and recovery. The deep, bone-wearying exhaustion of her ordeal began to recede, replaced by the quiet rhythm of the isolated homestead. She scrubbed the cabin floor until the planks were pale and smooth. She mended the threadbare curtains with a needle and thread she found in a small sewing box. She took Elias's worn shirts and patched the elbows, stitching with a precision that calmed her frayed nerves. These small tasks were an anchor. They were work, not charity. They were her way of paying him back in the only currency she had left, her labor. She began to cook, using the meager supplies in his larder, flour, beans, salted pork. She made meals that were simple but savory. She'd leave a plate for him on the table before retreating to the bedroom, and in the morning, the plate would be clean, left by the door. They ate apart, communicated through these silent offerings and acceptances. It was a strange, delicate truce. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, Elias came back early. A storm was brewing in the west, the sky a bruised purple. He was leading a lame horse, his face grim. Clara was outside, tending to a small patch of dirt by the creek where she'd found some wild mint and yarrow growing. She was trying to coax a small garden into existence, a patch of life in the stubborn soil. He saw her and stopped, surprised. "You shouldn't be out here. Storm's coming." "I saw," she said quietly, wiping her hands on her dress. "Is your horse all right?" "Twisted his foreleg in a prairie dog hole. He'll be fine, but he's no good for a while." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the faint color that had returned to her cheeks, the way her hair caught the strange, pre-storm light. She wasn't the broken creature from the auction block anymore. She was quieter, more watchful, but the light in her eyes was her own again. He gestured to the cabin. "You best get inside." He spent the next hour in the barn, tending to the horse. The storm broke with a fury, rain lashing against the roof and wind howling through the junipers. Clara watched from the cabin window, a pot of stew simmering on the fire. When she saw him finally trudge from the barn, soaked to the skin and shivering, she did something she hadn't dared to do before. She opened the door for him. He stood on the threshold, dripping water onto the floor, looking hesitant to enter his own home. "Come in, Elias," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll catch your death." She had a dry blanket waiting, draped over the back of a chair by the fire. "There's stew." He looked from her to the fire, to the blanket, and something in his guarded expression shifted. He stepped inside, shucking his wet coat and hat by the door. He took the blanket she offered and wrapped it around his shoulders, the shivering slowly subsiding as the warmth of the fire seeped into his bones. He sat at the table, and for the first time, she served him herself, ladling the thick, fragrant stew into a bowl. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the roar of the storm outside. It wasn't an awkward silence this time. It was a comfortable one, a shared shelter. "The sewing," he started, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. "My shirts." "Thank you." Clara just nodded, her gaze fixed on her bowl. "The food," she whispered. "Thank you." It was an exchange of gratitude, a formal acknowledgement of the unspoken contract that had formed between them. He provided shelter, she provided care. But sitting there in the warm, fire-lit cabin with the storm raging outside, it felt like something more. It felt like the beginning of a partnership. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable. The larder was nearly bare, and Elias needed to get medicine for the lame horse. The trip to Dust Devil Springs was a necessity they both dreaded. Elias was quiet as he hitched the wagon, his face set in grim lines. "You don't have to come," he said, not looking at her. "I can manage." "No," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not a prisoner. I won't hide." It was a small act of defiance, but it felt monumental. She would not let fear rule her. She had been shamed publicly. She would not now live in private shame. He looked at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He simply nodded and helped her up onto the wagon seat. The town felt different this time. Before, she had been invisible until she was made a spectacle. Now, she was an object of intense, whispered curiosity. As they drove down the main street, curtains twitched in windows. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking and stared. The women looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw her swollen belly, the quiet, grim-faced man beside her, and they drew their own conclusions. Their first stop was the mercantile. The proprietor, a balding man named Henderson with watery eyes, watched them enter. His gaze slid over Elias and fixed on Clara with a leering sort of pity. "Thorne," he said, his voice oily. "Didn't figure you for the type to be shopping for damaged goods." Elias's body went rigid. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "You want to repeat that, Henderson?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her. This was what she had feared, that her presence would bring trouble down on him. But before Elias could do anything else, she stepped forward, placing a hand gently on his arm. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson, her chin held high. "We need flour, beans, coffee, and a bottle of liniment," she said, her voice clear and cold. "Unless, of course, Mr. Thorne's money is no good here." Henderson was taken aback by her directness. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's simmering anger and seemed to reconsider his position. Antagonizing a man like Thorne, who lived outside the town's social confines and had a reputation for minding his own business until provoked, was not a wise commercial decision. He flushed. No, of course not. Money's money." He turned away, bustling to gather their items, his bravado gone. As they left the store, their supplies loaded into the wagon, Clara felt a strange sense of victory. She had not cowered. She had spoken. And Elias had been ready to fight for her honor. The thought sent a warm, unfamiliar flutter through her chest. He helped her back onto the wagon, his touch lingering for a second longer than necessary on her elbow. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, a new understanding passed between them. He wasn't just her protector out of duty, and she wasn't just his charge out of necessity. They were standing together. As they drove out of town, leaving the whispers and stares behind, the desolate space on the wagon seat between them felt just a little bit smaller. The road back to Thorn Creek felt like a road leading home. The seasons began to turn, the brutal heat of summer mellowing into the golden light of early autumn. Life at Thorn Creek settled into a predictable, comforting rhythm. The unspoken tension between Clara and Elias gradually eased, replaced by a quiet companionship built on shared tasks and mutual respect. He taught her how to read the clouds for rain and how to tell the difference between the track of a coyote and a wolf. She, in turn, brought a softness to his harsh existence. The cabin, once just a shelter, started to feel like a home. She found a patch of wild sunflowers and put them in a tin can on the table. She learned the quirks of his wood-burning stove, coaxing perfectly brown bread from its temperamental oven. The smell of baking bread often greeted him now when he came in from the fields, a sense so deeply comforting it seemed to smooth the weary lines from his face. One evening, while mending one of his shirts by the firelight, she found a small, smooth stone in his pocket. It was a simple creek stone, but one side had been worn perfectly flat. She remembered. As children, they had called them skipping stones. Elias had been the champion, able to make a stone dance across the water 5, even 6 times. She had never managed more than 2. She smiled, a small private thing. She placed the stone on the mantelpiece, a silent acknowledgement of a memory that belonged to them both. The next day, when she went to gather eggs from the small coop Elias had built, she found something resting on the nest box. It was a small, intricately carved bird, whittled from a piece of soft pine. Its wings were outstretched, as if in mid-flight. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. She remembered carving a clumsy-looking squirrel for him once, when they were no older than 10, using her father's dull pocket knife. She'd cut her thumb in the process. Elias had insisted on washing and bandaging it for her himself. She looked from the perfect little bird in her hand toward the barn where he was working. He remembered, too. These small, silent exchanges became their language. They spoke of a shared past and a tentative present. But the future, and the child growing within her, remained an unspoken territory. Clara's pregnancy was advancing, her belly now a proud, round curve that she no longer tried to hide. Elias was studiously respectful of her condition. He started leaving the heaviest water buckets on the porch for her. He took over the task of chopping firewood entirely. He never mentioned the baby, yet his actions were those of a man preparing for its arrival. He began to repair a small, disused cradle he'd pulled down from the barn loft, the rhythmic sound of his sanding and hammering a gentle backdrop to their evenings. Clara would watch him, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and fear. This quiet, gentle life they were building was a fragile bubble. Jedediah Finch was a shadow in the back of her mind, a threat that could resurface at any moment. She knew Elias had saved her, but she didn't know why. Was it pity? A sense of duty from their childhood connection? She dared not ask, for fear the answer would shatter the peace she had so desperately found. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the slow, plodding gait of a neighbor or the purposeful clip-clop of the mail carrier. This was a man on a fast horse, riding hard. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She was in the garden, and she froze, the trowel falling from her hand. Elias was in the corral, breaking a young colt. He saw the rider at the same time she did. He stopped what he was doing, his body going still and watchful, and walked to the edge of the fence, positioning himself between the approaching stranger and the cabin. The rider was a man named Slim, a drifter who sometimes did odd jobs around the area. He was known to have ridden with Finch's crowd for a time. He pulled his horse up, his eyes darting around the homestead before landing on Elias. "Thorn," he said, nodding. His gaze slid past Elias and fixed on Clara in the garden. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his face. Well, I heard Finch was looking for some lost property. Seems you found it first." Elias's voice was as cold and hard as Riverstone. "This is my property. You're trespassing. State your business or ride on." Slim laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "No business. Just passing the word. Finch is in Sagebrush, a few days' ride from here. He's been a skin after a certain dark-haired girl, offering a reward. A handsome 1 inch," he winked at Clara. "You might be worth more than a sack of flour after all, sweetheart." The casual cruelty of his words made Clara feel cold all over. The fragile bubble had burst. The outside world had found them. Elias moved with a speed that was startling. He vaulted the fence in one smooth motion and was standing in front of Slim's horse before the man could react. He reached up and grabbed the horse's bridle, his knuckles white. "Listen to me," Elias said, his voice a low, deadly hiss. "You will ride out of here, and you will forget you ever saw this place. You will forget her face. If word of your visit gets back to Finch, or if I ever see your face on my land again, I will make you regret the day you were born. Do you understand me?" Slim's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He had seen bar fights and standoffs, but he had never seen this kind of cold, lethal promise in a man's eyes. He nodded quickly, yanking his reins back. "All right, Thorn. All right. No trouble." Elias let go of the bridle. "Get." Slim didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his horse and galloped away, not looking back. Elias stood there for a long moment, his back to Clara, his shoulders rigid. The dust settled around him. The immediate threat was gone, but a larger, more menacing one now loomed over them. Finch knew she was in the area. He was looking for her. It was only a matter of time. He finally turned and walked toward her. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. The silence was heavy with everything they hadn't said. "He won't get you," Elias said, his voice raw. "I won't let him." And in that moment, Clara knew. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just duty. She saw it in the fierce, protective fire in his eyes. He was afraid. Not of Finch, but for her. He was afraid of losing her. And with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, she realized she felt the same way. The thought of being dragged away from this place, away from this quiet, decent man, was more terrifying than the auction block had been. Because then, she had nothing to lose. Now she did. That night, the peace of their home was gone, replaced by a taut, anxious energy. They ate their dinner in near silence, the unspoken threat a third presence at the table. After they had finished, Elias didn't retreat to the barn. He stayed at the table, staring into the depths of his empty coffee cup. Clara cleared the plates, her movements slow and deliberate, every nerve on edge. "He's offering a reward," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "He'll send others, men who aren't as easily scared as Slim." Elias looked up, his eyes dark with worry. "I know. He'll tell them I'm his wife," she continued, her voice trembling slightly as she voiced her deepest fear. "He'll tell the law I ran away from him, that I stole from him. People will believe him. He has money, influence." "It doesn't matter what he tells them," Elias said, standing up and beginning to pace the small cabin, his long legs eating up the space. He was like a caged animal. "This is my land. You're under my protection." "For how long?" Clara cried, the words bursting out of her. "How long until the sheriff comes knocking, Elias? What claim do you have on me? You bought me in a town square like a heifer. That's not a claim the law will recognize over a husband." The word husband hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. Elias stopped pacing and looked at her, his face etched with turmoil. He knew she was right. His moral claim on her, his fierce desire to protect her, meant nothing in the eyes of the law. Jedediah Finch, with his lies and his money, could walk in with the sheriff and take her, and there would be nothing he could do. He walked to the hearth and braced his hands on the mantelpiece, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The little carved bird she had found sat there, a tiny, fragile symbol of the peace that was about to be shattered. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, with hard work and grim determination. But this was a problem he couldn't fence out or wrestle into submission. He felt her presence behind him, knew she had come to stand just a few feet away. "My father. He told Finch he could marry me," she whispered, the confession costing her dearly. There was no paperwork, no preacher, just a promise. But Finch will say there was. He'll create a story, and the law will take his side. Elias turned around slowly. Her face was pale in the flickering firelight, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. All this time, he had been focused on the physical threat of Finch. He had not truly considered the legal one. Finch wouldn't need to come with guns. He would come with the law on his side. A terrible, cold knot of dread formed in Elias's stomach. He looked at Clara, at her gentle face, her swollen belly that held a new life, a life that had nothing to do with him, but that he felt a desperate urge to protect. He thought of the quiet joy he'd felt seeing her in the garden, the simple comfort of sharing a meal, the way the cabin felt empty when she wasn't in it. The thought of Finch putting his hands on her, dragging her away, it was unendurable. There was only one way to give him a claim that would stand up against Finch's lies. One way to protect her and the child, to bind them to this land, to him, in a way that no sheriff or judge could undo. The idea was radical, terrifying, and in that moment, utterly necessary. He took a deep breath, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "there is one way. To make my claim legal. To protect you for good." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. "Marry me," he said. The words came out in a rush, stark and simple in the quiet cabin. "Marry me, Clara. Be my wife." Clara stared at him, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. The words hung in the air, audacious and overwhelming. Marry him. It wasn't a declaration of love, not a whispered promise in the moonlight. It was a strategic move, a legal maneuver, a shield to be raised against the coming storm. And yet, hearing him say it, seeing the desperate sincerity in his stormy eyes, it felt like more than that. It felt like a lifeline. Her mind raced. A marriage of convenience. A transaction, just like the auction, but for a different purpose. Protection instead of servitude. But it was still a bargain. Could she do that? Could she bind herself to this man, to this life forever? She looked around the small, warm cabin, at the patched curtains, the cradle in the corner, the little carved bird on the mantel. This wasn't a prison. It was the only home she had ever known. And Elias, he was not a master. He was a kind, quiet man who had shown her more decency in a few months than she had ever received in her life. He had asked for nothing and given her everything he had. Fear was a cold, familiar companion, but as she looked at Elias, another feeling began to surface, something warm and tentative and brave. Trust. She trusted him. She trusted his strength, his integrity. She trusted the gentleness in his calloused hands. Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to know. Was this just about Finch? Just about duty? Elias took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt as though he could see straight into her soul. "What I want," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal, is for you to be safe. What I want is to never see that look of fear in your eyes again. What I want is for you to stay." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that spread through her entire body. "If being your husband is the only way I can guarantee that, then yes, Clara, that is what I want." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking relief. She had been passed from one man to another, sold and bartered. Now, for the first time, she was being chosen. Freely, honorably. She gave a small, jerky nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. "Yes, Elias, I will." A visible wave of relief washed over his features, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of a real, unguarded smile touch his lips. The decision was made. The die was cast. They would face Finch not as a rancher and his ward, but as husband and wife. The reprieve granted by their decision was short-lived. Just 2 days later, as Elias was chopping wood, he saw a buggy approaching. It wasn't a fast-moving threat, but something more official, more ominous. It was Sheriff Brody, and sitting beside him, dressed in a fine city suit that looked laughably out of place in the dusty landscape, was Jedediah Finch. Elias's axe froze mid-swing. His heart turned to ice. They were here. He set the axe down deliberately and walked to the porch of the cabin, his movements calm and measured, belying the storm of rage and fear inside him. Clara appeared in the doorway behind him, her face ashen. She had seen them too. He put a hand back, a small gesture for her to stay put, to stay behind him. The buggy pulled to a stop. Sheriff Brody, a portly man who valued an easy life above all else, looked uncomfortable. Finch, however, was the picture of smug confidence. He hopped down from the buggy, a malicious smile playing on his lips. "Thorne," Finch said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I believe you have something of mine." "The only thing on this land that's mine is the land itself," Elias replied, his voice flat and even. "You're not welcome here, Finch." Finch laughed. "Oh, I think I am." "Sheriff," he said, turning to the buggy, "this man is harboring my runaway wife, Clara. She also absconded with a significant amount of my money. I've come to reclaim my wife and my property." Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, looking at Elias with a weary expression. "Elias, you know the law. If this woman is his wife—" "She is not his wife," Elias stated, his voice ringing with authority. "She is," Finch insisted, his voice rising. "We were married by a justice of the peace in St. Louis. She's a flighty thing, prone to hysterics. And now, carrying my child, her condition has clearly made her unstable. I've been worried sick." His performance was flawless, full of feigned concern and paternalistic charm. Clara shrank back in the doorway. His lies were so smooth, so believable. She saw the doubt in Sheriff Brody's eyes. "Elias," the sheriff said, his tone turning official, "I'm going to have to ask the lady to come out and speak for herself. If she corroborates Mr. Finch's story, you'll have to turn her over. It's the law." This was the moment. The countdown was over. There was no more time for planning. Elias took a deep breath. She won't be coming out, and she won't be going anywhere with him. Finch's smile widened. "You see, Sheriff? He's holding her against her will. The man is a kidnapper." "No," came a clear, steady voice from the doorway. Clara stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Elias. She was trembling, but her head was high, her eyes fixed on Finch. She would not cower this time. "He is not holding me against my will." Finch's face darkened with anger at her defiance. "Clara, my dear, don't be foolish. Tell the sheriff the truth. Tell him how this man has confused you." "I will tell him the truth," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. She looked directly at Sheriff Brody, ignoring Finch completely. "The truth is that Jedediah Finch is a liar and a monster. He abandoned me when he found out I was with child. He brought me to Dust Devil Springs and sold me, Sheriff. He allowed me to be put on an auction block and sold for the price of a sack of flour." A gasp came from the sheriff. He He looked at Finch, whose face had turned a mottled red. "That's a damnable lie." Finch sputtered. "Is it?" Elias said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, grimy piece of paper. It was the receipt from the mercantile for $10, with a scrawled notation from Silas Croft at the bottom. For the woman, he held it out for the sheriff to see. Brody's eyes widened. He had heard the rumors of Croft's impromptu auction, but he had dismissed it as drunken gossip. Here was something tangible. "That proves nothing," Finch snarled. "A forgery. A trick." "It's no trick," Clara said. She took a step forward, her presence commanding. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman fighting for her life, for her child's life. "Sheriff, the man you see before you is my betrothed. Elias Thorne and I are to be married." Finch let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Married? To him? A dirt-poor rancher who had to buy you? Don't be ridiculous, Clara. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," she shot back, her voice ringing with newfound power. "But I choose to stand with him." Elias put his arm around her shoulders, a solid, unwavering anchor. He looked at the sheriff, his expression resolute. "We're riding into town this afternoon to see the preacher. You can be a witness, Sheriff. You can see for yourself that this is her free choice. You can see for yourself that Mr. Finch's claim is based on nothing but air and lies." Sheriff Brody was caught. On one hand, he had Finch, a wealthy, influential man. On the other, he had Elias Thorne, a respected, if solitary, member of the community, and a woman who spoke with the undeniable ring of truth. And he had that damning receipt. To ignore it, to side with Finch, would be a gross injustice, one the whole town would hear about. His easy life was suddenly very complicated. He looked from Finch's furious face to the united front on the porch. He made his decision. "All right, Thorne," he said, his voice firm. "I'll follow you into town. We'll settle this with the preacher. But Finch, you'll come along. You can make your case to Reverend Michael, same as them." It was a small victory, but a crucial one. They had bought themselves a stage for the final act. Finch looked apoplectic, cheated of his easy triumph. But he had no choice but to agree, confident that his charm and money could still win over a small-town preacher. As the sheriff turned his buggy around, Elias looked down at Clara. He gave her shoulder a small squeeze. They had stood their ground. Now, they had to win the war. The main street of Dust Devil Springs was buzzing with an unnatural energy. Word had spread like wildfire. Sheriff Brody's buggy, followed closely by Elias and Clara in their wagon, was a procession that drew people from their homes and businesses. They gathered in a silent, expectant crowd in front of the small, white-steepled church, their faces a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and a dawning sense of a great drama about to unfold. This was more than gossip. This was a reckoning. Reverend Michael, a man with kind eyes and a spine of quiet steel, was waiting on the church steps. He had been alerted by the sheriff and looked gravely at the approaching parties. Jedediah Finch stepped forward first, his composure restored, his face arranged in an expression of pained sincerity. "Reverend," he began, his voice smooth as honey, "thank you for seeing us. I am Jedediah Finch. This is a deeply painful, private matter, but I am here to reclaim my wife, Clara." He gestured toward her, his tone one of a long-suffering husband. "She is unwell, easily influenced. This man, Thorne, has taken advantage of her condition. I only want to take her home, to care for her and our unborn child." The crowd murmured. Finch's story was plausible, his performance convincing. He looked like a gentleman, a man of means and standing. Elias, in his worn work clothes, looked like what he was, a struggling rancher. Reverend Michael's gaze shifted to Elias and Clara as they stepped down from their wagon. Elias stood tall, his hand resting protectively on the small of Clara's back. He did not look at the crowd, only at the preacher. "Reverend," Elias said, his voice steady, "what Mr. Finch says is a lie. Clara is not his wife. He abandoned her. He shamed her. I took her in because it was the right thing to do. We have come here today to ask you to marry us." A wave of shocked whispers rippled through the onlookers. This was not just a dispute, it was a showdown. "Marry them," Finch scoffed loudly, playing to the crowd. "Reverend, you cannot. She is already bound to me in the eyes of God." Reverend Michael held up a hand for silence. He looked at Clara, his expression gentle but discerning. Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying clearly. "The truth must come from you. Tell me, in the presence of God in this town, what is your story?" This was it. The entire world seemed to narrow to this single moment, to the space on the church steps. All eyes were on her. Clara took a deep breath, drawing strength from the solid presence of Elias beside her. She felt the faint flutter of her baby moving within, a tiny life depending on her courage. She would not fail. She stepped forward, away from Elias's protective stance, to stand alone. She looked not at the preacher, not at Finch, but at the faces in the crowd. She saw the women who had scorned her, the men who had laughed at her. She would make them see. "My name is Clara May Thompson," she began, her voice shaking only for a moment before it found its strength. "I am not Jedediah Finch's wife. I was his mistake. He promised me marriage, a home. He lied. When he learned I was carrying his child, he told me I was a burden. He brought me to your town, and when his money ran low, he used me to settle a gambling debt." Her words were stark, unadorned. The raw truth of them silenced the crowd. "I was put on a platform, in the square where you buy and sell your horses," she continued, her voice rising with a righteous anger she didn't know she possessed. "And I was auctioned, not for dollars, not even for cents. A man offered a sack of flour for me, and your auctioneer was about to accept it." She paused, letting the shame of that fact settle over the town. "This man," she turned and looked at Finch, her eyes blazing with a fire that made him take an involuntary step back. "This fine gentleman allowed that to happen. He left me to that fate." Finch's face was a mask of fury. "She's hysterical. She's lying. Am I?" Clara's voice was sharp as steel. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a playing card, the Queen of Hearts. This was the card he drew that lost him the pot, and me with it. He laughed when he threw it on the table. He said, "The Queen is worthless today." The personal, vicious detail was more damning than any legal document. It was a truth that could not be faked. It exposed the core of his character, the callous cruelty beneath the fine suit. The mood of the crowd shifted palpably, the murmurs now turning to outrage directed at Finch. "And then this man," Clara said, turning to look at Elias, her expression softening, her voice filling with a profound, unshakable gratitude. "This man stepped out of the crowd. He did not know my story. He only saw a person in trouble. He paid $10, a fortune for him, to give me my dignity back. He took me to his home, and he gave me shelter and safety and asked for nothing in return. He has treated me with more kindness and honor than I have ever known." She turned back to the preacher. "I'm not bound to Jedediah Finch by any law of God or man, but I wish to be bound to Elias Thorne. I am not marrying him for protection. I am marrying him because he is a good and decent man, because I choose him. I love him." The final words, unplanned and utterly true, hung in the air, luminous and powerful. Elias looked at her, his face a picture of stunned, breathtaking joy. He had not dared to hope for such a thing. He stepped forward, taking her hand. He pulled a small object from his pocket. It was a simple, thin gold band, his mother's wedding ring. He had kept it all these years. He slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "Reverend," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Clara, "will you marry us?" Reverend Michael looked at the couple before him. Their hands joined, the simple gold band shining on her finger. He looked at the humiliated, exposed face of Jedediah Finch, and at the crowd, whose judgment had completely turned. "Yes," the preacher declared, his voice booming with conviction. "Yes, I will." Finch, defeated and disgraced, pushed his way through the crowd, which parted for him with open disgust. Sheriff Brody watched him go, making no move to stop him. He knew justice, real justice, had been served. As the preacher began the simple, sacred words of the marriage ceremony, Elias Thorne looked at his bride, Clara May, no longer the auction woman, but the woman who had saved herself, and in doing so, had saved him too. The sun shone down on them, and for the first time, their future felt as wide and promising as the western sky. The ride back to Thorn Creek was a world away from the two previous journeys. The first had been a flight of silent terror and shame. The second, a foray of nervous defiance. This one was quiet, too, but it was the quiet of deep, settled peace. Clara sat close to Elias on the wagon seat, her hand resting in his, the simple gold band on her finger a warm, solid weight. She was no longer a refugee he was harboring. She was his wife. She was home. As they passed the boundary of his land, she saw it differently. The stubborn junipers seemed to stand like sentinels, guarding their sanctuary. The creek sparkled in the late afternoon light, a ribbon of life and promise. The small log cabin, nestled in the clearing, was not just a shelter. It was the heart of her world. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and jumped down. He came around to her side, but instead of just helping her down, he simply scooped her up into his arms. Clara gave a small gasp of surprise, her arms instinctively going around his neck. "Elias, what are you doing?" she laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "It's tradition," he said, his voice gruff but his eyes smiling. He carried her, with a slightly clumsy but earnest strength, across the threshold of the cabin. He set her down gently inside, his hands lingering on her waist. The small room was filled with the golden light of the setting sun. It felt transformed, consecrated by the vows they had taken. "I love you, Clara," he said, the words coming easily now, as if a dam had broken inside him. "When you said it on the steps, I meant it," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the weary lines that now seemed softer. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you gave me that first cup of coffee." He leaned down and kissed her, a real kiss, full of all the unspoken words, the shared fears, and the fierce, protective love that had grown between them in the silence. It was a kiss that sealed their new beginning. Later that evening, they sat on the small porch. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched the stars begin to prick the deep purple sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Elias had his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. He placed his free hand gently on her belly, a gesture that was now natural and right. At that moment, he felt it, a distinct, firm kick against his palm. His eyes widened in wonder. He looked at Clara, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his face. "He's strong," he whispered in awe. Clara smiled, covering his hand with her own. She corrected him gently. "I think it's a she, and she's strong, just like her father." She meant Elias, and he knew it. He looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the land he had fought so hard to tame. It was still a harsh and unforgiving place. Their life would not be easy. There would be droughts and storms, hardships and heartaches. But for the first time, the solitude of the landscape didn't feel lonely. It felt like a kingdom. He looked at the woman beside him, her face serene in the starlight, and at the home they had made, a fortress built not of logs and stone, but of courage and compassion. He had ridden into town to buy a person in chains, and in freeing her, he had found his own heart, his own home, his own freedom. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.